The engines coughed once, then sputtered into silence. In the icy air of the Ardennes that December morning, the sudden stillness felt almost unnatural. Moments earlier, the ground had trembled under the weight of steel treads. The snow had vibrated with the growl of engines, and men had shouted above the metallic clamor. Now the forest swallowed everything. No roar of Maybach engines, no rumble of tracks, only the muffled crunch of boots in snow and the faint creak of frozen trees. Joachim Peiper, 30 years old and already a colonel in the Waffen-SS, stepped down from his command vehicle. He had led tanks across the steppe of Russia, through the mud of Italy, and now into the heart of Belgium. He was Hitler's chosen spearhead in the Great Ardennes Gamble, tasked with nothing less than cracking the American front wide open, seizing crossings over the Meuse, and racing toward Antwerp. And yet here, at the edge of a nameless village, his mighty spearhead had been reduced to immobility by the simplest of reasons. The tanks had run out of fuel. Men clambered from their turrets, stamping their boots to fight the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds. Some cursed quietly, others simply stared at the white horizon, as though waiting for orders that might change their fate. They had known fuel was tight. Every man in the German army did by the winter of 1944, but few had realized just how fragile their advance truly was. For all the months of planning, all the deception, all the artillery thunder that had opened the Ardennes offensive, the entire scheme now balanced on the capacity of a few hundred jerry cans. Peiper clenched his gloved fists. He knew the plan by heart. His Kampfgruppe had been chosen for its speed, aggression, and elite reputation. The Americans, Hitler had insisted, were soft. With surprise and momentum, they would fold. German armored columns would seize their fuel and supplies on the move, replenishing themselves as they drove toward the coast. It was bold, it was reckless, and now, in the cold dawn of December 17th, it felt like a fantasy crumbling in real time. Around him the Ardennes lay quiet, deceptively peaceful. The rolling hills and dense forests, cloaked in snow, seemed untouched by war. Smoke from farm chimneys drifted lazily upward. The landscape concealed both friend and foe, American patrols, Belgian villagers, and the frozen ground itself, hard as iron beneath their boots. Yet for Peiper, none of it mattered if his tanks could not move. The silence was broken by a report from one of his officers. An American fuel dump had been spotted nearby, just outside the village of Hansfeld. The words struck Peiper like an answered prayer. He gave the order instantly. Engines that could still run lurched forward, infantry fanned out along the road, and the column descended into Hansfeld with desperate anticipation. The sight that greeted them was almost surreal. Where the Americans had hastily retreated, they had left behind a depot of unimaginable abundance. 50,000 gallons of gasoline lay stacked in neat rows of drums and cans, still half hidden under canvas, some knocked open by the retreat. Fires burned in stoves. Coffee still steamed in mugs left on tables. The air reeked of petrol so sharply it stung the nostrils. For a moment, Peiper and his men simply stared. After weeks of rationing, of eking out every liter, of planning every maneuver around fuel shortages, here was a sea of gasoline, enough to keep his entire battle group moving for days. Soldiers shouted with disbelief, then laughed, their relief almost giddy. One officer scribbled in his notebook, "We were like starving men stumbling on a feast." Peiper walked among the rows of cans, his boots crunching on icy gravel. He ran a gloved hand over the steel drums, noting the stenciled markings, shipped from Texas, through New York, across the Atlantic, then trucked into Belgium by American convoys. Oil from wells halfway across the world had arrived here in weeks, while Germany's once proud synthetic plants lay in ruins from Allied bombs. Each drum, Peiper realized, was more than fuel. It was a symbol of the enemy's strength. He ordered his men to begin siphoning, pumping, loading. Engines roared back to life one by one, exhaust fumes curling into the winter air. The spearhead could move again. Yet beneath the momentary relief, Piper felt a gnawing unease. The sheer scale of what the Americans had left behind was staggering. They had abandoned 50,000 gallons as though it meant nothing, as though they had oceans more waiting behind them. For Germany, that amount could have kept entire divisions in action. For the United States, it was expendable. That contrast weighed on him as heavily as any artillery barrage. The depot at Hansfeld was both salvation and revelation. It meant his men could continue the attack, yes, but it also revealed the hopeless arithmetic of the war. Germany was trying to fight an empire of oil with empty cans. Still, there was no time for reflection. Orders crackled over the radio, scouts reported American resistance ahead, and the column began to grind forward once more. Tanks refueled hurriedly, crews slamming hatches shut, treads biting into snow-packed roads. In the distance, artillery rumbled, muffled by the forest. Piper climbed back into his command vehicle, his face a mask of determination. He would push on as ordered towards Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and the Meuse beyond. The offensive still hung in the balance. Perhaps, if the Americans continued to retreat in disarray, his Kampfgruppe could achieve the impossible. But in the back of his mind, the image lingered. The endless rows of American fuel cans, the casual abundance of a nation that could discard 50,000 gallons in a single retreat. For all his ruthlessness, for all his faith in the Führer's plans, Piper could not banish the thought that the war itself might already have been decided. Not in the forests of the Ardennes, but in the oil fields of Texas and the skies above Germany's shattered refineries. The morning silence had returned, broken only by the renewed rumble of engines. The spearhead moved forward once again, deeper into Belgium, carrying with it both the promise of advance and the shadow of inevitability. The figures spoke louder than any battlefield order. 50,000 gallons. It was a number almost incomprehensible to German soldiers who had spent months measuring fuel in liters, in cups, sometimes in drops. A Panzer IV could drain its fuel tank in a single day of hard fighting. A Tiger in mere hours. For Piper's entire Kampfgruppe, this depot represented life itself. A sudden, dazzling windfall. The men swarmed over the depot like ants on sugar. Tank crews hauled jerry cans to their machines, passing them hand to hand, shouting and laughing. Drivers pumped gasoline from drums into makeshift funnels, splashing it across gloves and boots. The bitter cold made the fuel's fumes even sharper, searing nostrils and throats. But nobody cared. To the men, this was not merely fuel. It was freedom, the power to move, to attack, to keep fighting. Yet as the first engines roared back to life, a strange tension spread among the officers. Some exchanged uneasy glances. The sheer volume of it all was staggering. 50,000 gallons sitting in tidy stacks, abandoned by an enemy in retreat. Why had the Americans left so much behind? Was it oversight or arrogance? Had they withdrawn so quickly they hadn't time to destroy it? Or did they simply not consider it worth saving? One lieutenant knelt beside a steel drum, brushing snow from its painted markings. He read aloud the stenciled words, Texaco, New Jersey. A silence fell around him. The men stared. Texas oil. It had traveled across the Atlantic in tankers, been pumped through pipelines in Britain, ferried across the Channel, loaded into convoys of olive-drab trucks, and hauled here to a tiny Belgian village, all in a matter of weeks. By contrast, the soldiers knew their own story. Back in Germany, bombers had smashed the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pörlitz, cutting production to a fraction of its former output. Railways were shattered, storage depots burned out shells. Civilians siphoned gasoline from abandoned cars to keep stoves lit. Commanders were forced to abandon armored vehicles in training grounds because there was no fuel to move them. And here, in Hansfeld, stood a mountain of gasoline, left behind by an enemy so rich in oil that he could discard it without a second thought. Piper walked slowly through the depot, taking it all in. He saw soldiers tearing into crates of American rations, their faces lit with boyish delight as they pulled out chocolate bars, cigarettes, even canned fruit. He heard laughter when one of them found a half-finished pot of coffee still steaming on a stove inside the nearby house. For a moment, it felt like victory, as though fate itself had chosen to reward his spearhead. But Piper's instincts gnawed at him. He had been a soldier too long, seen too many campaigns turn on invisible forces: weather, logistics, morale. He realized that this abundance was no accident. It was a glimpse into the vast machinery behind the American army. If they could abandon 50,000 gallons here, how much more lay waiting behind them? That thought struck deeper than any shell burst. It meant that his mission, to fuel his advance by seizing American supplies, was at once possible and doomed. Possible, because here was proof that fuel depots did exist in abundance across Belgium. Doomed, because for every depot captured, there would be 10 more the Americans could torch or replace without a blink. Still, he had no choice. Orders were orders. His Kampfgruppe had to push westward, across the Amblève River, toward the bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts. Time was precious. Every hour lost risked American reinforcements closing in from the north and south. Piper gave the signal. Crews filled their tanks to the brim, lashed extra jerry cans to turrets, stacked fuel drums on half-tracks. Trucks were overloaded until their suspensions groaned. It was a frantic, desperate loading, less an organized refueling than a frenzied looting. Every man feared that within minutes the miracle might vanish, that enemy artillery or aircraft might appear overhead. Meanwhile, a curious phenomenon began to unfold. Some of the tanks, after being topped off with American gasoline, coughed and sputtered in protest. German Maybach engines designed for high-octane synthetic fuel did not always digest the Allies' blend easily. Crews cursed as engines stalled, then tinkered with carburetors and filters, trying to coax the machines into life. For some, the irony was bitter. Even abundance came with complications. Piper climbed atop his command panther and surveyed the scene. The depot stretched before him like a bizarre battlefield trophy. Rows upon rows of steel drums glinting in the pale sun. He imagined what this sight would mean to Berlin, to Hitler himself. Proof that the Ardennes offensive could be supplied, that the Americans' soft underbelly truly could be exploited. And yet, he also imagined what it meant to the American commanders who had ordered the retreat. To them, perhaps, this fuel was not treasure at all, but expendable, disposable, the way a wealthy man leaves coins scattered on the table after paying his bill. That realization chilled him more than the Ardennes winter. Because wars, he understood in that moment, were not won only by courage or even by strategy. They were won by what lay behind the lines, the factories, the pipelines, the ships, the endless flow of resources. And in that invisible war, Germany was already lost. The order came to move out. The tanks, their bellies full once again, rumbled forward. The snow-muffled roads shook under their weight, exhaust plumes trailing into the frosty air. Behind them, the depot at Hansfeld grew smaller, though its image would remain burned into Piper's mind forever. For his men, it had been a miracle. For their commander, it was a revelation and a warning. The 50,000 gallons of hope were also 50,000 gallons of despair, proof of the gulf that separated the two armies. Ahead lay more battles, more rivers to cross, more fuel to seize. But in that fleeting moment, as his spearhead roared westward once more, Piper carried with him the uneasy knowledge that he was not merely fighting American soldiers. He was fighting an empire of oil. The depot at Hansfeld was not only a windfall of gasoline, it was also a mirror, reflecting back the grim reality of Germany's position in the war. As Piper's men filled their tanks and lashed American jerry cans to turrets, they noticed documents scattered across the depot office: shipping manifests, inventory sheets, logistical reports stamped with American insignia. Curious soldiers leafed through them, tracing the journey of the fuel. One noted dates barely 2 weeks old. Another laughed bitterly as he read of shipments arriving without incident from New York Harbor. That detail struck home. Oil from Texas had been drilled, refined, shipped across the ocean, trucked into the Ardennes, and it was still fresher than the gasoline in German tanks. What took the Americans mere weeks, Germany could no longer achieve at all. Back in Berlin, the Reich's industrialists and planners had already known the truth for months. Since the summer of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had methodically targeted Germany's fuel lifelines. Synthetic hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Merseburg, and Berlin had been reduced to twisted skeletons of steel. The great refinery at Pöhlitz, once a jewel of German ingenuity, lay in ruins, its chimneys broken, its pipelines mangled. Production, which had supplied half of Germany's wartime fuel needs, collapsed by nearly 90%. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, had delivered his warnings in stark terms. Even with heroic repair efforts, the plants could not recover. The Allies returned again and again, sending waves of bombers that turned each night's repair into the next day's rubble. By autumn, Luftwaffe generals were reporting that their fighter squadrons could barely scrape together enough aviation fuel for a few hours of flight. Pilots sat idle on airfields, their Messerschmitts grounded not by enemy fighters, but by empty fuel tanks. For the Wehrmacht, the crisis seeped into every branch. Panzer training programs were cut back. New tank crews learned their craft not on moving vehicles, but in classrooms with chalk diagrams. Supply columns were reduced to horse-drawn carts, a bitter regression to the First World War. Civilian life mirrored the Army's deprivation. Abandoned cars lined village roads, their tires rotting, their tanks dry. Housewives scavenged wood or coal briquettes, while black market gasoline changed hands at absurd prices. Even the mighty U-boat fleet, once a terror of the Atlantic, limped from port with half-filled tanks, often unable to reach their patrol zones. And yet in the Ardennes, Piper's men were drowning in fuel. But it was enemy fuel. That contradiction lay at the heart of Hitler's gamble. The Ardennes offensive, Wacht am Rhein, had been conceived not merely as a military strike, but as an act of resource desperation. The plan assumed, from the start, that German forces would capture American depots along the way. The Wehrmacht's logistical staff did not even attempt to disguise the arithmetic. Without enemy gasoline, the panzers could not reach Antwerp. It was strategy built on theft, a campaign designed around the hope of plundering what Germany could no longer produce. To the men on the ground, the consequences were painfully obvious. Every order to advance came with a question whispered among crews. Do we have enough to get there? Commanders agonized over whether to commit fuel to side attacks or save it for the main thrust. Captured American trucks were pressed into service, not just for their transport capacity, but because their engines drank the same plentiful gasoline found in depots. Every liter became a weapon, every can a bargaining chip in a war of attrition that Germany was destined to lose. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to treat fuel as limitless. Soldiers leafing through the Hansfeld papers found references to something called Red Ball Express, a trucking network moving supplies from Normandy to the front 24 hours a day. Others read of Pluto, the pipeline under the English Channel pumping fuel directly into Europe. To the Germans, these projects sounded almost like science fiction. One SS man muttered, half in awe and half in despair, "They move rivers of oil through the ground itself." Piper himself could not ignore the symbolism. The depot reminded him of briefings he had heard months earlier, when officers whispered about how America produced 2/3 of the world's oil. Germany, by comparison, had been forced to squeeze fuel from coal, to gamble on Romanian oil fields, to guard every shipment like treasure. When those sources vanished under Allied control or bombardment, the Reich was left clutching empty cans. The battlefield evidence was everywhere. In the villages they passed, German soldiers saw their own abandoned vehicles from earlier retreats, trucks left by the roadside, Panzer hulks rusting in barns, all victims of dry tanks. Even the mighty Tiger tanks, feared by Allied crews, had become more liability than asset. Without fuel, they were immobile bunkers, eventually abandoned and destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The Ardennes campaign had resurrected them for one last gamble, but only by chaining their future to the enemy's abundance. The irony bit deep. As Piper's column refueled and moved on, he knew they were chasing an illusion. They could seize this depot, perhaps the next, maybe even another beyond that. But behind every one of them stood the full weight of American industry, churning out more fuel, more tanks, more trucks. The imbalance was not measured only in gallons, but in the very fabric of modern war. For the German soldier, the crisis cut to the soul. They had fought in Russia against endless spaces and brutal winters. They had marched through the Balkans, rolled into France, climbed the mountains of Italy. Yet here in Belgium, they were undone not by courage or tactics, but by a liquid they could neither see nor hold in sufficient quantity. A Tiger tank without fuel was just 50 tons of iron. A Luftwaffe squadron without aviation spirit was just a row of grounded aircraft. Heroism could not ignite an empty tank. The Americans seemed to understand this truth instinctively. Their strategy was not merely to outfight Germany but to outproduce it, to strangle it at its weakest point. Every bomb dropped on a refinery, every convoy that crossed the Atlantic widened the gap. By December 1944, that gap was no longer a matter of degrees, but a chasm. Hansfeld had revealed the truth in the most brutal way. For the men of Kampfgruppe Piper, 50,000 gallons was salvation. For the American Army, it was pocket change. And in that cruel disparity lay the unmasking of Germany's fuel crisis, not just a logistical shortage, but the fatal weakness of the Reich itself. As Piper's tanks roared westward once more, their engines newly fed with American gasoline, the contradiction gnawed at him. They had captured enough to move today, perhaps tomorrow, but beyond that, the question had no answer. The tanks would roll until the cans ran dry, and then the silence would return. On the snowy roads of Belgium, Piper's men struggled with jerry cans and siphons, treating each gallon as if it were gold. Yet across the Atlantic, in the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, pumps hammered day and night, throwing millions of barrels to the surface with an effort so casual that Americans scarcely thought about it. That was the true imbalance of the war. One side fought for teaspoons, the other drowned in oceans. By 1944, the United States produced more than two-thirds of the world's petroleum. Texas alone yielded more oil in a single month than Germany could scrape together in an entire season from coal to liquid plants and shrinking Romanian wells. In Houston and Port Arthur, colossal refineries belched smoke as they refined crude into gasoline, aviation spirit, and lubricants in quantities that seemed limitless. Tankers queued at American ports, their holds filled with black gold, then steamed eastward across convoy routes guarded by destroyers and aircraft. For every ship sunk by U-boats, 10 more arrived safely. Germany's plight could not have been more different. Even at the height of its conquest, the Reich never possessed more than a fraction of the oil reserves required for mechanized war. The Ploiești fields in Romania, their one major natural source, were bombed into ruin by 1943-44. Synthetic fuel plants, though a technical marvel, consumed vast amounts of coal and manpower, and once the Allies focused their bombers on them, they became death traps of twisted steel. The more Germany relied on technology to conjure fuel from stone, the more fragile its lifeline became. On the battlefield, the imbalance revealed itself in countless small humiliations. American convoys thundered along highways with tanks full to the brim, each truck carrying 5 tons of fuel or ammunition. German convoys, if they moved at all, relied on horses pulling wagons. Their cargo measured not in tons but in sacks. American tankers poured gasoline into Sherman tanks as if watering crops. German crews, by contrast, whispered calculations before every movement. Could they spare the liters needed for reconnaissance, for redeployment, for pursuit? The logistical ingenuity of the Allies only deepened the disparity. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, had laid flexible pipes across the English Channel, pumping fuel directly from Britain into continental Europe. At full capacity, the system could deliver 1 million gallons a day. To the Germans, hearing rumors of this pipeline sounded like fantasy, as though the Americans had discovered a way to turn the sea itself into fuel. But the fantasy was real, and it allowed Allied armies to advance without fear of running dry. Then there was the Red Ball Express. Beginning after the Normandy landings, this network of trucks, many driven by African-American soldiers who worked in exhausting shifts, carried supplies from the beaches and ports to the front lines around the clock. Convoys rolled day and night, headlights covered, engines groaning, tires splattered with mud, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. The arteries of war pulsed with an energy Germany could neither match nor interrupt. For every gallon Piper captured in Belgium, the Red Ball delivered thousands more to the front. The numbers told the story more brutally than any propaganda. An American armored division consumed nearly 100,000 gallons of fuel per day. For Germany, that figure represented an impossible dream. When German commanders saw Americans burn entire depots during retreat, hundreds of thousands of gallons set aflame in a single night, they did not see recklessness. They saw the cold mathematics of power. The enemy could afford to destroy what Germany could not even imagine possessing. Piper, standing amid the depot at Hansfeld, felt that truth pressing on him. 50,000 gallons had seemed like a miracle, but in the American system, it was a rounding error. Somewhere behind the front, trains, trucks, and pipelines delivered millions more. It was as though he and his men had found a drop from an endless river. For Hitler, of course, the imbalance was always explained away by willpower. He raged about cowardly generals, about traitors, about the softness of the West. But soldiers on the ground knew better. They saw it in their stalled tanks, in the empty jerry cans rattling at their sides, in the Luftwaffe fighters rusting on airfields. The Third Reich had built its empire on steel and blood, but without oil, both were useless. Meanwhile, American industry transformed oil into strategy. A Sherman tank was not as heavily armored as a Tiger, nor did it carry as large a gun. But there were always more Shermans, always fueled, always moving. Air power multiplied the imbalance further. Allied bombers darkened the skies in waves of hundreds, each aircraft fueled and armed without hesitation. The Luftwaffe, reduced to scattering a few dozen planes here and there, became little more than cannon fodder. For the men of Kampfgruppe Piper, the imbalance was not an abstract concept. They felt it in their bones. Every order to advance meant another gamble against the fuel gauge. Every pause carried the dread of silence, the moment when engines coughed, sputtered, and died. And always, just across the battlefield, American trucks rolled with effortless abundance. The imbalance of oil empires shaped not only tactics but psychology. American soldiers carried an ease about them, a confidence born of knowing they would be supplied. German soldiers, even the elite SS, carried anxiety, suspicion, desperation. It was the difference between fighting with full lungs of air and gasping for breath. As Piper's spearhead pushed westward, Hansfeld faded behind them, but its lesson lingered. 50,000 gallons had granted them a reprieve, a temporary surge of momentum, but it also illuminated the hopeless truth. Germany could capture depots, burn horse-drawn wagons, even fight with ferocity unmatched. Yet none of it could reverse the imbalance. Wars of the 20th century were not decided only by courage or cunning. They were decided by oil, and in that realm, the United States was an empire unto itself, while Germany was already a beggar. Joachim Peiper was only 29 years old when the Ardennes offensive began, yet already he had become one of the most feared and celebrated officers of Hitler's Waffen-SS. To his men, he was both a ruthless commander and a charismatic figure who carried with him the aura of destiny. To his enemies, he was a name whispered with hatred, associated with massacres and a chilling efficiency. In December 1944, he became the tip of Hitler's last spear, entrusted with the role of piercing the Allied front and racing to the Meuse. Peiper A.S. Rise was the story of the Waffen-SS itself. Youth molded into steel by ideology and war. He had joined Himmler's personal staff at a young age, serving as adjutant to the Reichsführer SS, and quickly became known as one of the golden boys of the regime. Unlike the grizzled Wehrmacht officers who had grown up in the cautious traditions of Prussian command, Peiper belonged to a new breed. Bold, brutal, loyal only to Hitler and Himmler, unburdened by doubt. His confidence bordered on recklessness, but in a war fueled by fanaticism, it was precisely what the leadership demanded. When the Ardennes Plan, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was conceived, Hitler needed spearheads, armored groups that could break through the dense forests, smash the American lines, and push forward with relentless momentum. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, drawn from the 1st SS Panzerdivision Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was chosen for its reputation. The task was simple in theory but daunting in reality. Advance faster than the enemy could react, capture fuel depots along the way, and seize crossings over the Meuse. Once there, the road to Antwerp would open, splitting the Allied armies in two. Peiper relished the role. For him this was not merely another operation, it was destiny calling. His unit was the spearhead of hope, Hitler's gamble embodied in steel. But hope, like fuel, was a fragile commodity. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the German artillery barrage shattered the stillness of the Ardennes. Under the cover of fog, Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled forward. 117 tanks and assault guns, 149 half-tracks, and over 5,000 men. The tip of the spear gleamed with iron and ambition. Peiper himself rode at the front, urging speed above all. "Vorwärts! Faster!" he demanded, his voice cutting through the cold air. To him, delay meant death. Hesitation meant the collapse of Hitler's dream. Yet already the obstacles appeared. The roads were narrow, choked with snow and ice. Civilian carts clogged the routes, and American defenses, though surprised, fought stubbornly in villages and crossroads. Still, Peiper drove his men mercilessly forward. If a column stalled, he ordered it abandoned. If resistance was too stiff, he bypassed it. His orders reflected a single obsession: keep moving, no matter the cost. The men of the Kampfgruppe followed with a mixture of awe and fear. They admired Peiper's energy. He seemed tireless, driving his men as though fire burned inside him. But they also knew his cruelty. Captured prisoners were shot without hesitation. Civilians suspected of aiding the enemy were treated as obstacles to be cleared. In Peiper's worldview, mercy was weakness, and weakness had no place in a war where Germany's survival hung by a thread. This combination of speed and brutality gave the spearhead a terrible reputation. Villages trembled at the sound of its engines. American units that encountered it often broke in confusion, uncertain whether to fight or flee. Yet Peiper himself remained restless. He knew his tanks carried only enough fuel for a short drive. Unless they captured depots along the way, the spearhead would wither into silence. Every order he issued carried the shadow of fuel calculations. A Tiger tank burned nearly 5 gallons of fuel for every mile. A Panther, more efficient but still thirsty, devoured nearly 3. Trucks, half-tracks, motorcycles, all demanded their share. Peiper measured progress not in kilometers gained but in gallons remaining. When his men discovered the Hansfeld depot, he seized on it like a drowning man grabbing a rope. 50,000 gallons. It felt like salvation. But in his heart, he knew it was not enough. Still, the myth of invincibility drove him. Hitler had called him one of the few officers who could inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure. Himmler trusted him as a protégé. Even his enemies grudgingly respected his ferocity. To falter now, Piper believed, would be to betray his destiny. For the men under his command, that belief was contagious. They told themselves that if anyone could cut through the Ardennes, it was Piper. They painted the white crosses of the SS boldly on their vehicles, as if daring the Allies to stop them. Each mile gained felt like defiance of fate. Each village captured was proof that perhaps, just perhaps, Germany still had a chance. But the cost mounted quickly. Bridges were blown before they could be seized. American engineers fought with desperate courage, denying crossings and stalling the spearhead. Resistance in towns like Stavelot and La Glaise bled time and fuel away. And with every passing hour, the fog of surprise lifted. The Americans regrouped, and Allied air power prepared to return once the skies cleared. Piper sensed the trap closing. He drove his men harder, abandoning the wounded, ordering executions, burning villages, anything to maintain speed. The spearhead could not afford pity. It could not afford pause. Hope lay only in forward motion, like a shark that dies if it stops swimming. Yet inside his staff car, as the engines roared and maps shook in the wind, even Piper must have felt the gnawing doubt. Could a spear, no matter how sharp, pierce an enemy sustained by endless fuel, endless men, endless skies? His command was the embodiment of Hitler's last gamble. Bold, fanatical, ruthless. But a spear, once thrown, could not return. It either struck true or shattered on impact. In those bitter December days, Kampfgruppe Piper was both blade and symbol, the cutting edge of a regime that refused to admit defeat, and the fragile point upon which Hitler placed the weight of his fading empire. To his men, Piper was destiny in uniform. To history, he would become a reminder that even the sharpest spearhead, without the strength of supply behind it, cannot win a war. The fog lay heavy over the Ardennes on the morning of December 16, 1944. A damp, muffling blanket wrapped the forests, muting the sound of boots and engines. For hours, American sentries along the front thought it was just another cold, miserable day in what soldiers called a quiet sector. Then, at precisely 5:30 a.m., the ground shook. 1,000 German guns erupted at once, hurling fire into the American lines. The quiet sector became hell in an instant. Piper's men, crouched in their half-tracks and tanks, felt the air vibrate with the thunder of artillery. The barrage was brief but devastating. A curtain of iron meant to shock, not obliterate. As the last shells landed, the fog swallowed the battlefield again. Then engines roared to life. Kampfgruppe Piper lurched forward. The spearhead was moving. At first, the advance seemed almost effortless. American outposts, stunned and confused, were overrun quickly. Sleepy soldiers emerged from foxholes only to find panthers looming over them, their cannons already aimed. In villages scattered across the Ardennes, the first clashes were sharp and chaotic. Bursts of machine gun fire, grenades tossed into windows, tanks smashing through garden walls. German troops shouted commands and curses, their breath white in the cold air. But the Americans did not collapse. They fought back with stubbornness born not of preparation, but of instinct. At Lanzerath, a platoon of 18 men from the 394th Infantry Regiment held their ground against hundreds of advancing Germans. Hidden in trenches and behind farmhouses, they picked off attackers with rifles and machine guns, slowing the advance for nearly a full day. Piper raged at the delay. Every hour mattered, and here a handful of GIs had cost him precious time and fuel. Elsewhere, American artillery units responded with remarkable speed. Guns that had been silent for weeks now blasted at crossroads and road junctions, forcing German convoys to scatter. Horses pulling wagons bolted in terror. Trucks swerved into ditches. For Piper, it was the first reminder that even surprise had limits. The enemy might have been caught off guard, but he was not helpless. Still, the weight of the German assault told. At Büllingen, Piper's men captured a massive American fuel dump, more than 50,000 gallons of gasoline. Soldiers cheered as the black liquid was pumped into their thirsty tanks. For a moment, hope surged. The spearhead could keep moving, yet Piper allowed no celebration. He knew too well that fuel bought time, not victory. The deeper his men pushed, the more resistance stiffened. In Stavelot, American engineers fought fiercely to deny the Germans a crossing over the Amblev River. They dynamited bridges, laid mines, and held positions until overrun. Each delay was costly. Tanks idled as sappers cleared wreckage. The roar of engines gave way to silence, and silence meant danger. Every minute a tank stood still, its crew became a target for artillery or air attack once the weather cleared. The first clash in the Ardennes was not just a matter of bullets and shells. It was a clash of tempo. Piper demanded speed, a rolling avalanche that would carry his men to the Meuse before the Allies could react. The Americans, by contrast, needed only to slow him. Every skirmish, every stubborn defense, every bridge destroyed was a thorn in the side of the spearhead. The Germans advanced, but the pace was never what the plan demanded. By the third day, frustration spread through Piper's ranks. Columns stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush. Fuel trucks burned at the roadside, victims of American artillery. Prisoners, some captured with hands raised in surrender, were executed in ditches under Piper Ayes's cold orders. His men carried the reputation of ruthlessness like a banner, believing fear itself was a weapon. Yet even fear could not clear the clogged roads or conjure fuel from empty cans. American commanders, stunned at first, now began to react. Reinforcements from the 1st Infantry and 30th Infantry Divisions were rushed into the Ardennes. Tanks of the 3rd Armored Division began to arrive. The fog that had shielded Piper also shielded the Americans, allowing them to slip into defensive positions. The quiet sector was gone. The front was alive with movement and fire. The spearhead pressed on, but each clash grew bloodier. At Stoumont, Piper's tanks rolled into a village only to be met by American Shermans lurking in ambush. The battle devolved into chaos, houses collapsing under shell fire, civilians fleeing, wounded men screaming in the snow. For Piper, the clash was a brutal reminder that the enemy was not broken. He could strike with power, but he could not sweep resistance aside as if it were paper. And always, there was the fuel. Every move required calculation. How many gallons burned for a mile gained? How many jerry cans left in the trucks? Crews siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles, arguing over who deserved the last drops. Tanks with empty engines were abandoned, their crews joining the columns on foot. The spearhead, meant to be unstoppable, was already bleeding momentum. The first clash in the Ardennes was more than a battle of men and machines. It was the moment when two realities collided. Germany's last gamble surged forward with courage, ferocity, and desperation. America's unshaken supply lines, its stubborn soldiers, and its sheer weight of resources pushed back. The forest echoed with the sound of tank treads, gunfire, and shouted orders. But beneath it all was the quieter truth. One side was racing against the clock. The other simply had to endure. As Piper looked west, toward the Meuse, he knew the road was still open. Yet it was narrowing with every clash, every skirmish, every delay. The spearhead of hope was moving, but hope itself was thinning like the fuel in his tanks. The village of Hansfeld lay half buried in snow, its stone houses pressed tight against the forest like weary sentinels. When Kampfgruppe Piper rolled in, engines rumbling, the villagers peered from shuttered windows with the dread of people who had already seen too many armies pass. For the Germans, Hansfeld was not just another point on the map. Beneath its barns and sheds, stacked in drums and buried in makeshift bunkers, lay something rarer than gold: American gasoline. The discovery electrified Piper's men. After days of advancing on fumes, every jerry-can rattling half-empty, here was a prize beyond expectation. Soldiers swarmed the depot with the joy of children at a fair. 50,000 gallons, more than they had dared hope for. Tank crews clapped one another on the shoulders. Drivers grinned as hoses gushed liquid into thirsty engines. For the first time since the offensive began, the column felt invincible again. Yet the illusion began the moment the first pumps sputtered. A Tiger I tank guzzled nearly 500 liters for a day's operation. A Panther consumed 3 liters for every kilometer. Trucks, half-tracks, armored cars. Each machine demanded its share, and the column numbered hundreds of vehicles. 50,000 gallons, spread across that hungry army, was not a fortune. It was a ration. Piper knew it, though he said nothing to dampen the men's relief. Standing by a row of tanks as their engines coughed back to life, he allowed himself a thin smile. The fuel meant momentum, and momentum was everything. Still he kept the arithmetic in his head. 50,000 gallons meant perhaps 2 more days of movement. 2 more days before the spearhead slowed, before the illusion cracked. In Hansfeld, the soldiers behaved as though the war had tilted back in their favor. They marched through the streets with swagger, laughing, shouting, lighting cigarettes against the wind. Some forced open cellars and stole wine, toasting their luck. Others kicked snow over the bodies of American guards who had died defending the depot. For a brief evening, they believed they had seized not just gasoline, but destiny itself. But destiny is heavier than a jerry can. The Americans had abandoned Hansfeld reluctantly, only after stiff skirmishing. Survivors retreated westward, radioing frantic warnings. Within hours, intelligence reports reached higher commands. Piper's column had captured fuel. The message was clear. Stop him before he burned it into forward momentum. Bridges were ordered destroyed, choke points defended, artillery redirected. The fuel that made the Germans giddy also painted a target on their backs. Inside the depot, chaos ruled. The pumps groaned under constant use, men jostling for priority. Arguments flared. Which units should refuel first? Tank crews claimed primacy, insisting that without armor, the spearhead was nothing. Truck drivers shouted back that without supply, the tanks would be stranded. Officers barked, threatened, shoved. In the frenzy, gallons were spilled onto the snow, dark stains spreading like wounds. Soldiers cupped their hands to catch drips, unwilling to waste a drop. And still, the numbers did not lie. By dawn, much of the depot was empty. The engines that had roared with new life the night before were already drinking away the miracle. Some tanks rolled only a few kilometers before needing another refill. Mechanics siphoned fuel from wrecks, wringing the last trickles into cans. Piper's staff calculated routes with desperate precision, measuring miles against gallons, bridges against barrels. The 50,000 gallons that had felt infinite now seemed like sand slipping through clenched fists. The illusion of plenty was crueler than shortage. When fuel was gone, soldiers knew despair. But when it appeared in abundance, only to vanish in a blink, the despair cut deeper. Men who had toasted victory in Hansfeld now cursed at empty gauges. Hope had flared like a match in the dark, only to be snuffed out by the cold wind of reality. Piper, ever the iron commander, refused to let the mood collapse. He barked orders, demanded speed, pushed the column forward. "Faster!" he shouted, as if sheer momentum could outpace arithmetic. His men obeyed, spurred by fear as much as faith. Engines thundered, snow churned under treads. The spearhead lunged westward again. But every mile burned the illusion thinner. For the villagers of Hansfeld, the night of plenty became a nightmare. German troops stripped barns for shelter, seized food, shot livestock for meat. Civilians who protested were silenced at gunpoint. Children watched wide-eyed as men in black uniforms dragged barrels through the streets, the stench of gasoline filling the air. Some villagers whispered that the Americans would return soon. Others feared they never would. And in the morning, as the last trucks rolled out, Hansfeld stood in eerie silence, its depot drained, its people trembling. The Germans had left behind empty barrels and blackened snow. To the villagers, it was just another occupation. To Piper, it was another reminder of his precarious mission. To history, it would be remembered as a moment of false salvation. The night when 50,000 gallons promised victory, but delivered only delay. The spearhead pressed on, engines growling, men clinging to the illusion that fuel meant hope. But hope, like gasoline, burned quickly. Ahead lay rivers, bridges, ambushes, and the tightening grip of an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. The illusion of plenty at Hansfeld would fade into the cold truth of scarcity, and with it, the fate of Piper's command. By late 1944, the Reich was a machine without fuel. Every soldier at the front, every family in the cities, every official in Berlin felt it. The war was not just fought with tanks and rifles anymore, it was fought with gallons, liters, and drops. And Germany was running on empty. In the streets of Berlin, ration cards had long since replaced cash at gas pumps. But even those cards became little more than paper promises. Civilian cars vanished. Bicycles and horse carts took their place. Families collected firewood from ruined buildings because coal was scarce and oil for heating almost non-existent. Women queued for hours to buy kerosene, only to be told there was none left. The capital of the Reich, once illuminated by searchlights and parades, now shivered in darkness. The same poverty haunted the front. German divisions were nominally motorized, but by 1944, the image was an illusion. Horses, 2 million of them across the Wehrmacht, pulled artillery and supply wagons as if the war had slipped back into the 19th century. Infantry marched until their boots split. And tanks, the symbols of blitzkrieg, stood idle for lack of fuel. Crews sat beside them, smoking in silence, their mighty machines reduced to immovable bunkers. Hitler still dreamed of vast armored thrusts, arrows on maps sweeping across Europe. But reality mocked him. Generals whispered about the shortages with dread. A single Tiger battalion required nearly 20,000 gallons a week to operate. Fuel that simply did not exist. When commanders asked for reinforcements, they were told not that there were no tanks, but that there was no gasoline to move them. Strategy itself was being dictated by the fuel gauge. The contrast with the Allies was devastating. American units consumed fuel at a staggering pace, yet supplies flowed endlessly from depots and pipelines. A Sherman could drive all day without its crew worrying where the next refill would come from. British trucks rolled with confidence, their convoys stretching like steel rivers across France. Even the Soviet Red Army, supplied by American Lend-Lease fuel, surged westward with tanks that never seemed to stall. Germany's soldiers knew it. They watched the sky darken with Allied bombers, thousands of planes that required oceans of fuel to take off, yet never seemed to run short. They saw American tanks advance with arrogant speed, while their own columns stopped to siphon from abandoned vehicles. Every empty jerry can was a reminder that the Reich no longer had the lifeblood of modern war. In the factories, the story was no better. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Buna, and Politz had once been marvels of German engineering, conjuring gasoline from coal. But Allied bombers had reduced them to smoking craters. Workers labored to rebuild, only to watch new raids undo their efforts. Each month production fell further. By autumn of 1944, output covered barely a fraction of military needs. The Luftwaffe, once proud, was grounded. Fighters sat lined on runways, their engines cold, while pilots waited for fuel that never arrived. Soldiers at the front joked bitterly. "The Führer has promised us victory, but only if we can push our tanks by hand." It was gallows humor, masking despair. Officers rationed fuel so tightly that reconnaissance missions were canceled. Supply convoys left stranded, and entire operations delayed. When vehicles broke down, parts could sometimes be found, but not the gasoline to test repairs. For Joachim Peiper and his men in the Ardennes, the shortages were not a distant rumor, but a daily torment. Every advance was measured against dwindling reserves. Every decision, to bypass a village, to seize a bridge, to pursue a retreating enemy, carried the shadow of the fuel gauge. When they stumbled upon depots like Hansfeld, it felt like salvation. But the math never changed. What seemed like plenty was always a temporary illusion. Behind the front, civilians felt the war in their stomachs as well as in their bones. Bread grew thin, meat rare, heating oil non-existent. Farmers could not run tractors without gasoline, so harvests shrank. Trains, stripped of coal and oil, ran erratically, if at all. The once vaunted German efficiency dissolved into queues, black markets, and desperate improvisation. The nation's heartbeat slowed, every pulse weaker than the last. Yet propaganda insisted the Reich was strong. Posters showed tanks surging forward, planes soaring, soldiers charging with confidence. But those images were lies to cover an emptiness that everyone felt. The truth seeped into conversations in barracks, in kitchens, in factory halls. Germany was bleeding not just men, but fuel. And without fuel, there could be no future. By December 1944, Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes was more than a military operation. It was a desperate attempt to mask a nation's exhaustion. If Peiper and others could capture Allied depots, perhaps the Reich could breathe again, even for a few weeks. But such victories were fleeting, borrowed time at best. A nation on empty cannot win a war against empires overflowing with oil. The Reich had once imagined itself eternal. Now its engines sputtered, its furnaces cooled, its cities shivered. The soldiers in the Ardennes marched west not only against the Americans, but against the ticking clock of fuel starvation. And in that contest, no amount of bravery or brutality could prevail. Germany was a nation on empty, and nothing, not even the fiercest spearhead, could refill it. On December 18, 1944, Joachim Peiper's column thundered toward the Belgian town of Stavelot. The road was clogged with panthers, tigers, and half-tracks, their steel hulls rattling, engines guzzling the last of their precious reserves. For Peiper and his men, Stavelot meant more than a town on a map. Intelligence promised fuel depots there, rivers of gasoline waiting to be seized. If they succeeded, the offensive could surge forward. If they failed, their spearhead would wither. The men knew what was at stake. Every jerry can, every barrel, every drop mattered. As they rolled closer, they could almost smell it. The sharp sting of gasoline hanging faintly in the cold Ardennes air. Hopes rose in their chests. Visions of tanks refilled and engines roaring with new life. Some whispered to each other, "Once we take Stavelot, we'll never have to worry again." For a moment, the illusion of plenty seemed within reach. But the Americans were ready. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division had dug in at Stavelot, determined to deny the Germans the prize. They knew, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that fuel was the lifeblood of the Reich's gamble. Their orders were simple: hold the depots at all costs, and if they could not, destroy them. The clash was ferocious. Peiper's tanks forced their way across the Amblève River, steel grinding over stone, machine guns cutting into the defenders. Houses burned, civilians fled, and the narrow streets echoed with the thunder of battle. German soldiers surged forward, convinced that just beyond the smoke lay salvation. But then suddenly, the sky erupted. American engineers, retreating under pressure, had opened their torches and charges on the fuel stocks. Barrels were punctured, depots wired with explosives, and rivers of gasoline poured across the ground. Within seconds, fire leapt skyward, a wall of heat and flame engulfing everything. The fuel that Peiper's men dreamed of as liquid gold turned into an inferno. Flames raced along the Amblève's banks, the river itself appearing to burn, as spilled gasoline spread across its surface. Smoke boiled into the winter sky, black and choking. German tank crews stopped in their tracks, staring at the sight. Thousands of gallons consumed in an instant, roaring into nothingness. It was as if hope itself had been set alight and reduced to ash. Piper raged. He had gambled speed and blood for this moment, only to find the Americans had transformed abundance into denial. His officers reported that what fuel remained was scattered, inaccessible, or too dangerous to salvage amid the flames. Crews tried desperately to roll barrels away from the blaze, but many exploded like bombs, showering the streets with fire. Others watched helplessly as the reserves they needed most vanished before their eyes. The town of Stavelot became a vision of apocalypse. Civilians trapped in their homes felt the heat sear through walls. German soldiers stumbled through smoke, coughing, eyes red and streaming. The fire consumed not only the gasoline, but the illusion that Germany could replenish itself from captured stores. For Piper, the burning ocean of fuel was more than a tactical setback. It was the physical embodiment of the Reich's futility. Yet even as the flames devoured his hopes, he pressed forward. Orders from above demanded speed, demanded progress toward the Meuse. But with every mile the burden of fuel grew heavier. Tanks slowed, vehicles stalled, and every crewman knew the fire at Stavelot was not just a single lost depot. It was a warning. The Americans would burn everything before letting it fall into German hands. For the defenders, the destruction was an act of triumph amid retreat. Watching the black columns rise, American soldiers understood the power of denial. They had not only held back Piper's advance for crucial hours, but had robbed him of the one thing he could not fight without: fuel. The Ardennes offensive was meant to be lightning, a thunderbolt that would shock the Allies into paralysis. Instead, at Stavelot, it bogged down in fire and smoke. Piper's men drove on, but each tank was now a ticking clock, its engine a devourer of dwindling rations. The burning depots cast a long shadow over the entire operation. News of the disaster spread quickly among German units. Soldiers muttered with bitterness, "Stavelot is finished. The Americans would rather set the world on fire than let us win." The words carried both anger and awe. For them, the sight of oil-fed flames licking the sky was unforgettable. A reminder that they were fighting an enemy with resources vast enough to waste, to sacrifice oceans of fuel simply to deny them. In Berlin, the reports landed like hammer blows. Hitler had gambled everything on seizing Allied supplies, but the fire at Stavelot showed the gamble's folly. The Reich was clawing at shadows, trying to fill its veins with fuel that the enemy would never let it touch. Piper pressed on beyond Stavelot, but something had changed. His spearhead still cut forward, brutal and determined, yet hollowed out by inevitability. Every mile deeper into Belgium was bought not only with blood but with the dwindling roar of engines that could not be fed. The burning ocean at Stavelot lingered in their minds, a vision of both what might have been and what could never be. And so the Ardennes gamble, born from desperation, carried within it the seeds of failure. For in that Belgian town, on that cold December day, the Reich's last hope for fuel went up in flames, painting the winter sky with the black smoke of a dying dream. In the Ardennes, fire became a weapon sharper than bullets. For the Americans, it was not enough to resist with rifles or hold with artillery. They understood that the German spearhead was fueled not only by gasoline, but by desperation. If they could turn that desperation against the enemy, then every depot, every barrel, every gallon could become a trap. Fire was no longer an accident of war. It was strategy. The burning of the fuel stocks at Stavelot was only the beginning. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, Allied commanders issued ruthless orders: destroy supplies before the Germans could touch them. Gasoline depots were wired with explosives, fuel trains derailed and set ablaze, storage tanks emptied into ditches and torched. Soldiers who had once been trained to conserve now became saboteurs of abundance. To deny was to defeat. It was a reversal of power. The Germans, who once seized resources from conquered lands, now found themselves starving in a desert of fire. When they captured a village, its cellars no longer yielded treasure, but only charred ruins. When they overran an Allied position, they found barrels punctured, their contents flowing into the mud like rivers of wasted hope. The Americans had mastered the art of turning plenty into ashes. Piper's men felt the sting of this new strategy more than anyone. They had advanced with the expectation that enemy depots would feed their engines, that every conquered town would bring new life to their column. Instead, they marched into landscapes of flame and smoke. At Stavelot, at Trois Ponts, at countless crossroads, the same sight greeted them: black skies, burning rivers, and the acrid stench of lost fuel. One officer muttered, "They fight us with fire more than bullets." His words carried truth. The Americans understood that a destroyed gallon was as deadly to the Germans as a destroyed tank. Every fire lit behind them was another mile cut from the German advance, another engine destined to stall. The symbolism of it weighed heavily. For years, German propaganda had celebrated fire as the instrument of victory. The firestorms of Warsaw, Rotterdam, London. Now that same element turned against them, no longer a weapon of terror, but a method of starvation. Each blaze mocked the Reich's ambition, consuming the very thing it needed most. Civilians witnessed the transformation with awe and dread. They saw columns of smoke marking the path of retreating Americans, leaving behind not resources but scorched earth. To villagers, it meant hunger and cold, yet they understood the cruel logic. Better to burn than to give. Some whispered, "The Americans are feeding the fire instead of the Germans," and indeed, the flames served as both shield and sword. For the Wehrmacht, the psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had risked their lives to capture depots found themselves standing before pyres. Crews climbed down from tanks to watch fire consume the fuel they needed, powerless to stop it. Each blaze was a silent enemy, killing their advance without a shot fired. The fire strategy turned progress into futility. By late December, Piper's Kampfgruppe had become a spearhead without a shaft. His tanks were still formidable, his men still fierce, but their strength was undermined by the fires the Americans lit. What fuel they captured was quickly spent. What they hoped for was already destroyed. They pushed westward with the knowledge that the further they went, the less chance they had of returning. The Allies, meanwhile, grew bolder. Fire gave them time. Every burning depot delayed the Germans long enough for reinforcements to pour in. American armor, British divisions, artillery batteries dragged from reserve. What had begun as a desperate defense turned into a tightening net. And fire was the cord that bound it. The strategy echoed through history. Armies had long known the power of scorched earth. From Moscow in 1812 to the steppes of Russia in 1941. But in the Ardennes, it was refined into precision. This was not just the burning of crops or villages, but the destruction of a single resource with surgical intent. It was war distilled to its essence. Deny the enemy what he cannot live without. For Hitler, the reports were maddening. He had promised a breakthrough fueled by captured supplies. Yet his soldiers sent back only tales of flames, of depots lost to deliberate destruction. He raged at commanders, accusing them of cowardice or incompetence. But no fury could conjure gasoline from ash. His dream of reaching Antwerp was already burning in the same fires that consumed his fuel. By the time Piper reached Stoumont, his column was already bleeding dry. Engines coughed, vehicles stalled, and men looked nervously at dwindling reserves. The Americans had succeeded not only in halting him, but in hollowing out his advance. Fire had slowed the lightning. Fire had broken the blitz. In the Ardennes, fire became the silent victor. It consumed without mercy, destroyed without pity, and shaped the battlefield more decisively than bullets or bombs. The Germans had gambled on seizing plenty, but instead they inherited ashes. And so the winter offensive, the last great gamble of the Reich, was undone not only by soldiers and guns, but by the flames that turned abundance into emptiness. Fire had become strategy, and it was a strategy Germany could never overcome. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's so-called last gamble, was a thunderclap against the Allies. Yet the thunder was fleeting. Behind the front lines, the true war was not measured in shells or battalions, but in barrels and pipelines. The German thrust seemed miraculous at first. Heavy tanks surging through snow, columns of steel rolling where Allied commanders had believed the forest impassable. But every miracle demanded a machine behind it. The Americans had one. The Germans did not. By December 1944, the U.S. Army had become the most mechanized force in history. Its appetite for fuel was enormous, nearly 350,000 gallons a day to sustain the drive across France. But unlike the Wehrmacht, this hunger was always fed. The reason was not luck or geography, but an intricate, sprawling system that transformed raw oil from distant wells into the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. At its heart lay the refineries of Texas, California, and the Gulf Coast, working day and night, guarded like fortresses. From these plants, tankers carried gasoline across the Atlantic in convoys shielded by destroyers and aircraft. Even before the invasion of Normandy, Allied planners had prepared for the flood of consumption. Engineers built vast depots along the English coast, filling them with millions of gallons, waiting for the day when the armies would cross the Channel. Once ashore, the miracle extended itself through pipelines. Operation Pluto. Pipeline under the ocean, snaked across the seabed from England to France, delivering fuel straight to the continent. Though limited in capacity, it symbolized a larger truth. Wherever the Allies advanced, fuel followed, flowing as steadily as blood through veins. On land, engineers constructed temporary pipelines along roads, through forests, over rivers. Thousands of trucks of the Red Ball Express roared across France, carrying jerry cans and drums stacked to the sky. It was this machine that gave Patton S-tanks the power to dash hundreds of miles in weeks, that allowed bombers to rise in endless waves, that let the Allies maintain momentum while the Wehrmacht stumbled. Every American Sherman that rolled into Belgium carried behind it an invisible tail of oil wells, tankers, refineries, depots, pipelines, and convoys. The Germans, by contrast, had no such miracle. Their synthetic fuel plants were marvels of chemistry, but they stood naked under the Allied bombing campaign. Each raid on Leuna or Politz was a wound that never healed. Tankers from Romania no longer arrived. The Ploiești fields had been bombed into ruins. Even when gasoline was produced, moving it to the front was an ordeal. Trains targeted by fighter bombers, convoys shredded on roads. The Reich lacked not only oil but the system to move it. In the Ardennes, this imbalance decided everything. Piper's tanks were powerful, but their engines drank fuel faster than supplies could be captured. American Shermans, weaker on paper, never stopped moving, because behind them the machine ensured that the next refill was always waiting. What looked like tactical brilliance on the battlefield was, in truth, logistical mastery. The soldiers themselves noticed the difference. American tankers joked that they could smell gasoline wherever they went. There was always more around the corner. German crews, by contrast, siphoned from wrecks, fought over barrels, prayed that tomorrow would bring a depot not already destroyed. Hope became their fuel, and hope burned quickly. Allied commanders understood their advantage. General Eisenhower once remarked that the war was a logistical nightmare. But it was a nightmare America could afford. The nation's oil reserves were vast, its industry unrivaled, its shipping lanes secured by overwhelming naval power. Every gallon lost to enemy action was a drop in an ocean. For Germany, every gallon destroyed was an artery cut. At Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and Stoumont, the machine behind the miracle showed its power. The Americans could afford to torch depots Because they had more weighting. They could sacrifice thousands of gallons in fire without hesitation, knowing the next convoy was already on the road. For the Germans, watching those oceans of gasoline go up in smoke was like watching victory itself dissolve. Piper's men may have fought with ferocity, but they were fighting against more than the U.S. Army. They were fighting against an empire of oil and industry that stretched from the Texas plains to the Belgian forests. Every Sherman, every P-47, every truck roaring down a snowy road was a reminder of that vast machine. The miracle of the Ardennes was not that Germany managed to advance as far as it did, but that the Allies absorbed the blow without faltering. Behind the smoke and fire, the pipelines still pumped, the depots still filled, the convoys still rolled. The Reich could create one last storm, but the Allies could endure it because their machine was stronger, deeper, inexhaustible. As winter deepened and Piper's column ground to a halt, the truth became inescapable. No amount of bravery or brutality could overcome the imbalance. The German spearhead was a blade without a hilt, driven forward by empty promises. The Allies were a hammer built not of steel alone, but of oil, industry, and supply. The machine behind the miracle had spoken, and in its steady rhythm of tankers, pipelines, and convoys, the fate of the Reich was sealed. By December 19, 1944, Joachim Piper's spearhead had lost its momentum. The forested hills and icy valleys of the Ardennes that had once echoed with the roar of his engines now trembled under silence. Each mile forward had been purchased not only with blood but with the dwindling drops of gasoline that still sloshed in battered jerry cans. His Kampfgruppe had become a paradox, one of the most powerful armored units in the Reich, but one already suffocating from its own hunger. Piper's orders were unyielding: push west, break through to the Meuse, link with other panzer spearheads. Yet reality pressed harder than any command from Berlin. Tanks that once surged ahead now idled uselessly, their crews watching fuel gauges sink toward empty. Officers argued in hushed tones. Should they press on recklessly and risk being stranded, or should they conserve what little remained? Every decision became a gamble with no good outcome. Stavelot's inferno had robbed them of the reserves they needed most. Trois Ponts had denied them bridges. Now, as they approached Stoumont, American resistance stiffened. Infantry from the 30th Division, armored units, and artillery formed a wall of steel across Piper's path. Worse, the enemy had time. Every hour spent maneuvering cost fuel, while the Americans seemed able to replenish endlessly. Faced with the trap tightening around him, Piper turned to brutal calculation. He ordered his men to seize every drop of fuel, no matter the source. Civilian cars, farm tractors, abandoned Allied vehicles. Nothing was spared. Soldiers siphoned gasoline from anything with a tank, their desperation palpable. Local villagers watched in fear as German troops stripped barns and garages, dragging out whatever could burn. Even kerosene meant for stoves was poured into engines, despite the risk of damage. But desperation bred cruelty. Along the advance, Piper's men committed atrocities that stained the offensive in blood. At Baugny, near Malmedy, American prisoners of war were massacred in cold blood, a decision driven by fury, frustration, and the ruthless belief that hesitation could not be afforded. In other villages, civilians suspected of aiding the Americans were shot. For Piper's men, the line between necessity and brutality blurred until it vanished. The Reich had gambled everything, and its soldiers reflected that desperation with savage acts. Still, Piper pressed forward. At Stoumont, he launched his remaining strength in a bid to break through. Panthers and tigers rumbled into the village, guns blazing, infantry charging house to house. For a brief moment, the Germans tasted success, capturing parts of the town. But their fuel was vanishing even as they fought. Tanks that should have pressed onward stalled in the streets, their engines dead. Crews abandoned them, turning once proud machines into steel carcasses. American artillery rained down relentlessly, pounding the frozen ground, cutting off supply routes. Every German counterattack met fresh resistance, and as night fell, the once unstoppable spearhead found itself surrounded by enemies on all sides. The miracle of a breakthrough had withered into the nightmare of encirclement. Piper faced choices that no commander wanted. He could attempt to retreat, but retreat required fuel his column no longer possessed. He could hold Stoumont, but that meant slow strangulation as the Americans tightened the noose. Or he could gamble on one last desperate thrust westward, knowing it might doom his men if fuel ran dry. Each option was a road to ruin. In moments like these, the grandeur of Hitler's plan collapsed into the grim arithmetic of logistics. The grand arrows on maps in Berlin bore no resemblance to the battlefield's reality. Frozen roads, abandoned tanks, hungry soldiers, and the endless smoke of Allied fires denying them sustenance. Piper chose to gamble once more. His units fought savagely, clinging to every house, every street. They counterattacked with dwindling numbers, trying to punch a hole toward freedom. But each effort bled fuel and men alike. His tigers and panthers, symbols of German might, became trapped beasts, powerful but caged, roaring but unable to move. The brutality continued. Cut off from supplies and embittered by failure, Piper's men lashed out at civilians, destroying property, burning villages. To them, survival justified all. To history, it revealed the Reich's desperation stripped bare of pretense. By December 21st, the trap was nearly complete. American forces had severed the roads behind him, artillery bracketed every approach, and fuel reserves were reduced to fumes. Piper's command, once the sharpest spear of Hitler's gamble, was now a cornered fragment of steel and flesh, clinging to survival in the snowbound Ardennes. The decisions of those days, to burn, to massacre, to gamble recklessly, were born from the same truth. The Reich was a nation on empty, grasping at victory with hands already slipping into the abyss. The Ardennes offensive, once envisioned as a path to Antwerp, had become a desperate struggle to escape annihilation. And at its center was Joachim Piper, a commander caught between ambition and futility, between orders from Berlin and the brutal arithmetic of reality. His gambles had brought him deep into enemy territory, but every decision from now on would be made not with hope of victory, but with the grim intent to survive. The spearhead of hope had become the trapped beast of Stoumont. The Ardennes forest had swallowed many armies before, but never had it devoured one so quickly as Piper's Kampfgruppe. By late December 1944, the once proud spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, panthers, tigers, and hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, had been reduced to a stranded beast in the snow. The collapse did not come in a single thunderclap, but as a slow, grinding suffocation. At Stoumont, Piper's men fought with ferocity, but each attack bled them further. Every shell fired, every tank maneuvered, every truck moved forward consumed the last drips of fuel. Engines stalled in the streets, their steel hulls still warm but powerless. Crews abandoned them, sometimes after siphoning the final liters from their own machines into others. Even this scavenging could not stave off the inevitable. The Americans tightened the noose with methodical precision. Infantry dug in on the high ground, artillery bracketed the roads, and armor ringed the approaches. Where once Piper had driven forward with confidence, now his column sat pinned, forced into defense. The town of Stoumont itself became a prison of stone and ice. German soldiers crouched in cellars, firing from windows, fighting room to room. But the dream of a breakthrough was gone. All that remained was endurance. The collapse was more than tactical. It was psychological. Men who had once believed themselves the tip of a victorious spear now whispered of betrayal, of being sent into battle with no chance to win. Some cursed Hitler, others cursed fate, but most fell into grim silence. Their commanders urged them forward, but the fuel gauge dictated reality. Without gasoline, Even the strongest tank was nothing more than an iron coffin. Piper himself clung to discipline. He moved among his men, urging them to hold, to fight, to wait for relief from other panzer units that never came. His charisma still carried weight, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew they were alone. Reports filtered in of American reinforcements pouring into the Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored, endless convoys of men and machines. Against such abundance, his trapped Kampfgruppe was shrinking into irrelevance. The Americans exploited every weakness. They struck supply lines, ambushed stragglers, and poured artillery into crossroads until the ground itself seemed to rebel. At night, searchlights and flares turned the forest into daylight, robbing the Germans of concealment. And always, above the clouds, Allied aircraft circled, waiting for breaks in the weather to strike. For Piper's men, there was no sanctuary, only a tightening vice. Fuel starvation was relentless. Half-tracks were abandoned first, then trucks, then tanks left behind in yards and ditches. Each vehicle lost was not only a weapon gone, but a psychological wound. Proof that the spearhead was no longer moving forward, only disintegrating. Soldiers carried what they could on foot, trudging through snow, their breath white in the frozen air. The Kampfgruppe that had entered the Ardennes as a steel fist was dissolving into weary infantry, dragging themselves toward survival. The civilians of Stoumont watched in terror. The once unstoppable Germans now fought from their barns and gardens, burning houses for warmth, tearing doors from hinges for cover. To the villagers, it was clear. This was no longer an army of conquest, but of desperation. Every shot fired, every flame lit, was the death rattle of a force that had gone too far. By December 23rd, Piper faced the unthinkable. The roads behind him were cut. Relief was impossible. Fuel was gone. Ammunition dwindled. He had only one choice: abandon the heavy weapons that defined his Kampfgruppe. The order went out: destroy the tanks, spike the guns, and prepare to break out on foot. Crews wept as they set charges in their beloved Panthers and Tigers, machines they had cared for like children. The explosions echoed across the valleys, each detonation a nail in the coffin of the spearhead. That night, under cover of darkness, Piper led his men away from Stoumont. Nearly 800 survivors trudged silently through the snow, leaving behind hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, and comrades too wounded to move. They marched eastward, hunted by American patrols, harassed by artillery, but driven by the single hope of reaching German lines. The collapse was complete. What had begun on December 16th, as a mighty thrust of nearly 5,000 men and 100 tanks, had ended in a shattered column limping home on foot. Piper's Kampfgruppe had inflicted fear and destruction, but strategically it was broken. The spearhead of hope had snapped, leaving only fragments scattered across the Ardennes. For the Allies, the sight of burning Panthers and abandoned Tigers was proof that the offensive had failed. For the Germans, it was a bitter reminder of the gulf between ambition and reality. The Reich could still conjure fierce units, still unleash brutality, but without fuel, without supplies, without the machine behind the miracle, even its sharpest spear would shatter. The Ardennes forest was silent again, broken only by the crackle of burning tanks and the distant sound of boots crunching in snow. The Kampfgruppe that had once threatened to split the Allied front had collapsed into memory, another ghost in the endless graveyard of Hitler's dreams. The spearhead was gone, and with it, the last illusion of German invincibility. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with bold proclamations from Berlin. The promise of cutting the Allied front in two, of seizing Antwerp, of turning back the tide of war in one last thunderclap of German willpower. Yet by the final week of December 1944, those visions had been replaced with something colder, less forgiving: arithmetic. The mathematics of defeat had begun to write its verdict across the Ardennes. Every commander understood the numbers, even if they did not speak them aloud. The 6th SS Panzer Army had entered the offensive with just enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, if everything went perfectly. But war is never perfect. In reality, half the fuel was burned in traffic jams at the German border, in detours around blown bridges, in wasted idling as convoys waited for narrow roads to clear. By the time Kampfgruppe Piper stalled at Stoumont, their tanks had consumed more than 80% of their allotted supply without advancing even halfway to their objective. Fuel was not the only equation. Ammunition was counted in dwindling piles, artillery shells rationed by the hour. German batteries that once could deliver storms of fire now dribbled out a few shells at a time, their officers calculating which crossroads or which hedgerow justified the last rounds. Infantry companies that began with 150 men now had 60, many frostbitten or wounded. The mathematics was merciless. Every day reduced combat strength, every mile forward doubled the supply strain. In contrast, the Americans could add. Their arithmetic was not subtraction, but multiplication. As soon as Eisenhower recognized the scale of Hitler's gamble, convoys rolled west from depots in France. Trains carried ammunition by the tens of thousands of tons, trucks roared along the Red Ball Express routes, and divisions that had been resting after the liberation of Paris were thrown back into the line. The numbers grew daily. By Christmas, more than 250,000 Allied troops were engaged in the Ardennes. The Luftwaffe had promised to shield the offensive, but here too the numbers betrayed them. They could muster only a fraction of their former power. A few hundred serviceable aircraft scattered across Germany. Each sortie drained fuel reserves that no longer existed. Meanwhile, once the skies cleared, the Allies unleashed thousands of fighters and bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts prowled the roads, hunting convoys, while medium bombers shattered bridges and crossroads. The calculus was simple. The Luftwaffe could not replace losses. The Allies could. Hitler had gambled on surprise, hoping the initial shock would buy time to reach Antwerp before the Allied numerical advantage crushed his forces. But the shock faded quickly, and the numbers only worsened. The German order of battle revealed its fragility. Divisions designated as Panzer often had fewer than 40 tanks, many held together with scavenged parts. Ersatz battalions filled with teenagers or men in their 50s were asked to hold flanks against American armored divisions bristling with Shermans and tank destroyers. The mathematics of logistics was equally damning. German fuel depots had been bombed relentlessly throughout 1944, leaving the Ardennes offensive supplied by desperate stockpiles scavenged from across the Reich. Each captured Allied fuel dump promised salvation, but most were destroyed by retreating engineers before the Germans arrived. At Stavelot, Piper had found tens of thousands of gallons, only to see them burned by defenders who preferred flames to surrender. Numbers that might have extended his thrust simply vanished in smoke. For the German High Command, the figures became impossible to ignore. Reports flowed back from the front. Piper cut off, 116th Panzer stalled, 2nd Panzer destroyed near Selles, the 12th SS bleeding itself against American paratroopers at Bastogne. By December 26th, it was clear. Not a single armored division had reached the Meuse. The deepest penetrations had advanced only 50 miles, far short of Antwerp, and all at crippling cost. The mathematics of distance and fuel intersected with brutal clarity. Even if units could break through, they could not sustain themselves. Meanwhile, Allied numbers grew stronger with each passing day. By the end of December, Patton's Third Army alone had committed over 100,000 men to the relief of Bastogne. American artillery fired more shells in a single day than the entire Wehrmacht could supply to its Ardennes front in a week. The simple equation of production, Allied factories versus German industry bombed into ruin, was being written in fire across the battlefield. Soldiers at the front felt these numbers as lived reality. German tank crews counted liters of fuel like gold, rationing their movements to mere kilometers per day. American tankers, by contrast, filled their Shermans from jerry cans, and drove until engines smoked, knowing replacements were already on the way. German infantry received a few rounds of ammunition per man, told to hold until miracle relief arrived. Americans distributed bandoliers freely, their supply sergeants drowning in crates of bullets. For the German people back home, the numbers were hidden behind propaganda, but even they sensed the truth. Each telegram of a son lost, each empty shop shelf, each air raid warning was part of the same arithmetic. The Reich was living on borrowed time. The collapse of Piper's spearhead was not merely a battlefield setback. It was the embodiment of the entire war's equation. Germany had entered the conflict with bold dreams and temporary superiority. But by 1944 it faced an enemy whose resources dwarfed its own. The United States alone produced more oil in a week than Germany could hope to secure in a month. Britain and the Soviet Union added further weight. Against such sums, no tactical brilliance or ferocity could alter the outcome. As January 1945 dawned, the Ardennes offensive sputtered into retreat. Hitler had demanded Antwerp, but the mathematics of defeat had delivered only ruin. 100,000 German casualties, thousands of tanks and guns lost, irreplaceable fuel burned for nothing. The Allies suffered heavily as well, but their losses were numbers that could be replenished. For Germany, each loss was permanent, each subtraction a step closer to the abyss. The Ardennes campaign proved a brutal truth. Wars are not won by dreams, but by numbers. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, the arithmetic of history had spoken with finality. The Ardennes in January 1945 was a landscape of exhaustion. The snow that had once cloaked the German advance in secrecy now betrayed it, turning white fields into canvases painted with blackened tank husks and frozen corpses. Kampfgruppe Piper's retreat through the forests symbolized more than the failure of a single unit. It was the broader pattern of an entire army facing encirclement, and worse still, abandonment. By the end of December, the Germans who had poured into Belgium were trapped in pockets that shrank by the hour. Bastogne still burned in memory, a town that the Germans had sought to crush, but instead became the heart of Allied resistance. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the paratroopers, the Germans who once dreamed of surrounding the Americans found themselves encircled instead. The tide had turned, and the jaws of the trap were closing. Encirclement is more than a military term. It is a state of mind. Soldiers feel the circle tightening long before maps confirm it. Supply convoys vanish. Wounded men wait for evacuation that never comes. Officers speak in clipped tones, hiding their own fear. For German troops scattered across the Ardennes, it was the realization that every road eastward led not to safety, but to another American roadblock, another line of artillery waiting with open sights. In the north, remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army clung to positions near La Glaise and Stoumont, their tanks abandoned, their infantry huddled in barns for warmth. In the center, the 2nd Panzer Division, which had come closest to the Meuse River, was cut off and shattered, its survivors limping back through woods littered with burned vehicles. In the south, the once proud 5th Panzer Army could no longer hold Bastogne. American counterattacks pressed relentlessly, turning the salient into a coffin. And above it all hovered the terrible question, where was relief? Hitler had promised that fresh reserves would smash through and rescue the trapped divisions, but the truth was that no such forces existed. The Eastern Front was bleeding, with the Red Army preparing its own winter offensive. German industry was in ruins. Fuel stocks were empty. The Reich had gambled everything on the Ardennes and had nothing left to give. Abandonment settled in slowly, like frost creeping into the bones. Soldiers realized that their commanders were no longer planning victories, but merely calculating how many could escape. Orders shifted from hold at all costs to break out if possible. Heavy weapons were destroyed, tanks set aflame, artillery spiked and left behind. Units that had been proud armored formations devolved into columns of weary infantry trudging eastward, abandoning comrades too weak or wounded to march. For many, the sense of betrayal was sharper than the hunger in their bellies. Propaganda had promised that this offensive was the turning point, that they were striking a blow that would change history. Instead, they found themselves sacrificed in a hopeless gamble. Some cursed Hitler's name. Others whispered that the SS had led them into ruin. Many simply stared blankly, too numb to rage, their only instinct survival. The Americans, by contrast, could see the encirclement forming with mathematical precision. Aerial reconnaissance mapped every movement, every shrinking German pocket. Patton and Montgomery both drove their forces to close the trap, eager to destroy not just German units, but German morale. The Allies knew that each division lost in the Ardennes could never be rebuilt. Encirclement was not just a tactic, it was a strategy of annihilation. Villages became cages. In La Glaise, German troops waited in vain for rescue that never came, until finally slipping away on foot, leaving dozens of tanks to rust in the snow. In Houffalize, surrounded divisions tried to escape under cover of night, their boots crunching on ice, their breath giving them away to American patrols. The Ardennes, with its winding roads and narrow valleys, offered no mercy. Every path eastward funneled into Allied firepower. The sense of abandonment extended beyond the battlefield. In Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal, even as he refused to acknowledge the logistical impossibility of his plan. Orders still demanded offensives that could not be mounted, counterattacks that could not be fueled. For soldiers freezing in the snow, these commands were proof that their leaders had abandoned reality itself. Encirclement was not always absolute. Some German units slipped away, ghosting through the forests, scavenging food from abandoned farms. But even escape carried its own form of abandonment. Soldiers who returned to the Reich found bombed-out cities, civilians starving, and little recognition for their sacrifice. The homeland they had fought to defend seemed as indifferent to their suffering as their commanders had been. The men who marched eastward carried with them the bitter knowledge that they had been left to die for an illusion. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to avoid capture, to find a bed, a meal, a few more weeks of existence before the inevitable collapse of the Reich. The Ardennes had begun as a battlefield of ambition. It ended as a graveyard of trust. The circle closed in January, when the Allies linked up their counterattacks and the bulge itself flattened back into the line it had once been. What had cost Germany so dearly bought the Allies' confidence, proof that even Hitler's most desperate gamble could be contained and reversed. For the Germans, the encirclement and abandonment of their spearheads was not just a battlefield failure, but a psychological breaking point. They had seen what it meant to be left behind, and they would carry that memory all the way to the final collapse of the Reich. The snow was still falling when the truth became undeniable on the ground. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Yet in Berlin, in Führer headquarters, in command posts across the Reich, denial echoed louder than the reports from the front. To the soldiers in the frozen forests, the collapse was visible in every burning tank and every abandoned road. To their leaders, the collapse was invisible, hidden behind maps, arrows, and the unyielding voice of Adolf Hitler. The German command structure in late 1944 was a paradox. It possessed some of the most experienced generals in Europe, men like Gerd von Rundstedt, Walter Model, and Hasso von Manteuffel, but their expertise was shackled by a dictator who demanded victory at any cost. Hitler had conceived the Ardennes offensive in defiance of his staff's objections, and when its failure became clear, he refused to admit error. Orders still demanded counterattacks that were logistically impossible, reinforcements that did not exist, and fuel that could not be conjured. Generals who dared speak honestly paid a price. Rundstedt urged withdrawal as early as December 24th, warning that continued attacks would waste Germany's last reserves. Hitler ignored him. Model, the so-called fireman of the Reich, tried to salvage what he could, but even his talent for improvisation could not disguise the mathematical truth. The 6th SS Panzer Army was spent, the 5th Panzer Army was crippled, and the 7th Army had been reduced to a thin shield barely able to hold its flank. Still, Hitler demanded, "The offensive continues." The denial was not just at the top. Across the hierarchy, officers clung to illusions because the alternative was unthinkable. To admit failure meant admitting that the Reich itself was doomed. Reports sent upward were softened, losses understated, enemy strength minimized. Divisions described as holding firm were in fact dissolving. Tank battalions listed on paper contained only a handful of vehicles. It was a bureaucracy of lies, each layer hiding the depth of the disaster from the next. Meanwhile, the Allies read the truth in their reconnaissance photographs and prisoner interrogations. They knew German fuel was gone. New divisions were fighting at half strength. For Eisenhower and Montgomery, the question was not if the Ardennes offensive would fail, but how quickly Germany's denial would prolong the killing. Hitler's stubbornness had consequences measured in blood. Orders to retake Stavelot, to strike again toward Bastogne, to hold to the last man at St. Vith, all condemned thousands of soldiers to die in hopeless actions. The soldiers in the snow knew the futility, but they also knew the penalty for disobedience. Execution squads trailed the front, ready to shoot deserters and defeatists. In such a climate, denial was enforced at gunpoint. In staff meetings, Hitler's tone grew increasingly detached from reality. He spoke of fresh divisions being raised, of jet fighters arriving in mass numbers, of secret weapons that would turn the tide. His generals listened in silence, aware that the Reich could not even supply socks to its infantry, let alone fuel for an armored blitz. Some still hoped for a separate peace with the Western Allies, a chance to shift resources east against the Soviets. But Hitler would not hear of it. His hatred blinded him as much as his illusions. Denial spread beyond the command posts into the German people themselves. Propaganda broadcasts proclaimed victories in the Ardennes long after the spearheads had been destroyed. Newspapers printed glowing accounts of Allied units annihilated, even as American divisions pushed relentlessly forward. Families sent letters of encouragement to sons who were already dead or captured, unaware of the true scale of the disaster. The Reich's entire information system had become a fortress of denial, shielding civilians from reality until it was too late. But denial cannot outlast arithmetic. By January 1945, the numbers told a story even the most loyal officer could not conceal. More than 100,000 German casualties. Nearly 700 tanks and assault guns lost. Vast quantities of vehicles and artillery abandoned. Entire elite divisions gutted. These were not setbacks. They were mortal wounds. Germany had spent its last reserves in a gamble that had not even reached its first objective. Still, Hitler railed against his generals, accusing them of weakness, treachery, and cowardice. He dismissed Rundstedt, shouted down Model, and demanded that Himmler, a man with no military experience, take command of the Northern Front. It was a gesture of pure denial, replacing competence with loyalty, as though faith could substitute for fuel. The generals who remained obeyed outwardly but inwardly knew the truth. The war was lost. For the soldiers trudging back from the Ardennes, the denial of their leaders was a cruel betrayal. They had seen comrades freeze to death in foxholes, watched their tanks burn for lack of gasoline, and heard Allied bombers roar overhead in endless waves. To tell them that the offensive was still ongoing was not strategy. It was delusion. They returned to a homeland in ruins, led by commanders who refused to acknowledge the ruins. The Ardennes was more than a battlefield defeat. It was the exposure of a system built on denial. A Reich that promised invincibility could not admit weakness. A Führer who demanded obedience could not tolerate truth. And so, even as the circle closed around Germany from east and west, its leaders continued to issue orders that belonged to a fantasy, not to the world of men. The forest of the Ardennes remained littered with wrecks, each one a monument to denial. Panthers abandoned with empty fuel tanks, trucks stripped for parts, frozen bodies left unburied because there was no time to carry them away. These were not signs of a victorious counteroffensive. They were the debris of a regime that refused to see itself as defeated, even as defeat consumed it. In the end, German command's denial did not delay the inevitable. It only deepened the suffering. The Ardennes offensive had been the last great gamble, and its failure revealed the hollowness of the Reich. But in January 1945, within the walls of Hitler's bunker and in the shattered headquarters of his generals, the word defeat was still forbidden. Reality, however, could not be outlawed. It was marching westward with Patton, eastward with Zhukov, and raining from the skies with every Allied bomber. Denial could shield minds, but it could not shield a collapsing empire. The Ardennes offensive had been fought by men, but it had been decided by machines. Beneath the smoke of the battlefield lay a truth that even the most hardened veterans could not escape. By late 1944, the Second World War was no longer a war of maneuver or even of generals. It was a war of factories. Whoever could outproduce the other would win, and the factories of Germany had already lost. The numbers were merciless. American industry in 1944 produced nearly 50,000 aircraft, more than 20,000 tanks, and millions of tons of ammunition. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had become war arsenals, churning out jeeps, trucks, and Sherman tanks with an efficiency no German plant could dream of. Every day, convoys rolled from ports in France to the Ardennes front, carrying replacements in endless waves. For the Germans, each destroyed tank was a permanent loss. For the Americans, it was simply a number to be filled by the next shipment from Detroit. The imbalance was not just in quantity, but in logistics. The Red Ball Express, a highway of trucks stretching from Normandy to the front, ensured that fuel and ammunition never stopped flowing to the Allies. By contrast, German supply lines were fragile threads, stretched across bombed railways, sabotaged bridges, and forests clogged with snow. Allied planes hunted every convoy, turning fuel shortages into famine. The factories of the Reich still produced weapons, but without fuel, those weapons sat idle. In truth, the Battle of the Bulge was already decided before the first tank crossed into Belgium. Hitler could imagine victory. His generals could plan maneuvers, but the mathematics of production had rendered such dreams illusions. Germany in December 1944 could produce only a fraction of what it had built in 1940. Synthetic oil plants were in ruins from bombing raids. Ball-bearing factories had been flattened. The Rhine bridges were collapsing one by one under Allied bombs. It was not courage or tactics that would determine the outcome, but whether tanks had gasoline, whether guns had shells, whether soldiers had boots. Soldiers on both sides knew it, though few spoke of it openly. German panzer crews cursed the lack of fuel more than they cursed the Americans. They scavenged jerry cans like treasure hunters, their survival measured not in bravery, but in liters. American tankers, by contrast, drove with confidence, knowing fuel dumps waited only a few miles behind them. Infantrymen sensed the same imbalance. German soldiers went hungry, living off whatever they could seize, while Americans were supplied with hot meals, cigarettes, and even mail from home. It was not just a war of machines, but a war of morale, and factories shaped morale as much as generals. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of heroic stands, of German willpower defying the world. But even the most loyal citizen could see the contradiction. Bombs fell daily on cities. Food disappeared from shelves. Trains no longer ran on time. The Reich had promised a total war, but its factories could not match the total capacity of the Allies. America alone had an economy larger than all of occupied Europe combined. Add Britain's arsenals and the Soviet Union's relentless production behind the Urals, and the conclusion was inescapable. The Ardennes campaign revealed the futility of fighting a war of attrition against an opponent who could replace everything faster than it could be destroyed. Every Panther lost at Stoumont was irreplaceable. Every Sherman lost at Bastogne was already being replaced before the battle ended. The German soldiers' courage was real, but courage could not manufacture steel, could not refine gasoline, could not rebuild a factory flattened by B-17s. Generals understood this bitterly. Rundstedt and Model had both warned Hitler that Germany lacked the material to sustain a major offensive. They knew that even if Antwerp fell, the Allies would rebuild, resupply, and counterattack with overwhelming force. The Reich no longer had the industrial depth to absorb setbacks. Each gamble was all or nothing, and each loss hollowed the core further. For the Allies, the war of factories created a new confidence. Eisenhower did not need to gamble recklessly. He could wait, let the numbers work in his favor, let production grind the enemy down. Patton could hurl divisions forward with the assurance that replacements were on the way. Montgomery could delay his counterblows, secure in the knowledge that German shortages would worsen with every day. Strategy was shaped not by maps alone but by assembly lines thousands of miles away. Even the skies told the same story. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, flying a few hundred sorties, while the Allies unleashed thousands. Fuel shortages kept many German planes grounded. The Allies, fueled by Texan oil, and supplied by factories in California and Kansas, flew until their pilots were exhausted rather than their machines. The German fighter aces who still survived were lions trapped in cages, watching as Allied bombers reduced their homeland to rubble. The Ardennes was the last gasp of a military machine that no longer had an industrial engine. Hitler had believed that surprise, terrain, and willpower could compensate for weakness. But wars are not won by dreams. They are won by numbers stamped in steel, poured into gasoline barrels, and shipped in endless convoys. By the time the Bulge collapsed, even the most stubborn officer knew Germany was fighting not against soldiers, but against the factories of the world. When the remnants of Piper's Kampfgruppe limped back across the lines, they were symbols not of weakness, but of inevitability. No matter how skilled their crews, no matter how fearless their attacks, they had been fighting against an equation already solved. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Coventry, and Magnitogorsk had already written the ending of the war. The soldiers had fought. The generals had gambled, but the factories had decided. The Ardennes offensive ended not with a thunderclap of German triumph, but with the slow sputter of engines dying in the snow. The most powerful weapons of the Reich had not been destroyed in battle, but immobilized by silence. Their turrets still gleamed. Their guns still held the power to kill. Yet without fuel, they were nothing more than steel carcasses littering the forest roads of Belgium. Empty fuel tanks had defeated Hitler's last gamble. For the soldiers who lived through it, the memory of silence was stronger than the memory of explosions. Survivors recalled the eerie sound of nothingness as panzers ground to a halt. Crews abandoned their vehicles, sometimes destroying them, sometimes simply walking away, leaving behind the symbols of a vanished hope. In villages like La Glaise and Ligneuville, peasants would later climb inside panthers and tigers left by the roadside, marveling at the technology, but understanding instinctively why they had been lost. The legacy of the Ardennes was not only military, but symbolic. It proved that even the most advanced weapons were useless without the simplest of resources. A panther could outgun a Sherman. A tiger could dominate a battlefield, but without gasoline they were monuments to futility. Empty fuel tanks told the story more clearly than any communiqué. Germany had lost not just the battle, but the ability to wage modern war. Historians would later argue that the Ardennes marked the transition from tactical defeat to strategic inevitability. Before December 1944, there had still been whispers, among civilians, among soldiers, that perhaps a miracle might turn the tide. After the offensive collapsed, those whispers died. The German people saw the truth in their own towns. Tanks were left where they had stopped, too valuable to waste, yet impossible to move. Even in retreat, fuel shortages forced commanders to choose between saving men or machines. More often than not, the machines stayed behind. The Americans and British read the same lesson. Fuel had been the hidden weapon of the war. Allied armies had advanced from Normandy not just with courage, but with convoys of gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans. The Red Ball Express, powered largely by African-American drivers, had delivered what the Wehrmacht could not: the assurance that no tank would stop short of its target. In contrast, the German dream of a decisive blow collapsed because its fuel calculations were fantasy. The Ardennes offensive had depended on seizing Allied depots, turning enemy supplies into German lifeblood. When that gamble failed, so did the Reich. Among German officers, the bitterness was profound. Many had warned Hitler that launching an offensive without secure fuel reserves was madness. They knew that even a victory at Bastogne or St. Vith would only postpone the inevitable. When Kampfgruppe Peiper abandoned its tanks, the message spread across the army like wildfire. The Reich was bankrupt in energy, bankrupt in strategy, bankrupt in future. Empty tanks were a prophecy of collapse. The legacy of fuel shortages extended beyond the battlefield. It seeped into the psychology of a defeated nation. Civilians queued for hours for a few liters of coal substitute. Soldiers trudged on foot where once motorized columns had thundered. The Reich that had once dazzled the world with images of blitzkrieg, armies of tanks sweeping across Europe, now limped, hollow and broken. The blitzkrieg had been fueled by captured resources from Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Once those conquests were reversed, the engine of conquest ran dry. For the Allies, the sight of abandoned German armor was more than a tactical victory. It was reassurance that the war was nearing its end. Soldiers who had feared the menace of the Tiger tank now realized that superiority meant little without logistics. Fuel dumps mattered more than steel. Supply chains mattered more than strategy. The legacy for Allied planners was clear. In future wars, logistics would be the first and last concern. The Ardennes thus left behind a paradoxical memory. On the one hand, it was the last great offensive of the Wehrmacht, fought with desperate courage. On the other hand, it was the most vivid demonstration of Germany's bankruptcy. Veterans remembered the cold, the forests, the blood, but also the long columns of silent tanks, snow piling on their hulls, as though nature itself had buried the last illusions of Nazi power. The empty fuel tanks of 1944 became symbols in post-war history. They represented the arrogance of leaders who believed willpower could replace resources, and the folly of strategy divorced from logistics. Military academies studied the campaign not only for its tactics, but for its lessons in supply. The conclusion was repeated in every lecture hall: no army, however brave, can fight without fuel. In the end, the Reich did not collapse because its soldiers lacked courage. It collapsed because its machines lacked gasoline. From the skies above, Allied bombers had not only destroyed factories, but strangled the arteries of supply. From the ground, Allied troops had defended fuel depots with the knowledge that every drop was a bullet against the enemy. And from within, the German war machine consumed itself faster than it could replenish. When the war ended a few months later, rusting tanks still dotted the Ardennes. Children climbed on them, farmers stripped them for scrap, and historians photographed them as relics of futility. They were monuments not to glory but to emptiness. The panzers had been designed as weapons of conquest, but they had died as statues of failure. The legacy of empty fuel tanks was not just about defeat in one battle. It was about the collapse of a vision that had promised domination but delivered ruin. It was about the triumph of industry, logistics, and common sense over fanatic dreams. Above all, it was a reminder that wars are not won by the roar of engines, but by the fuel that keeps them running. And in the Ardennes, that fuel had run out.